This is probably a suicide.
And where the gun?
Yeah, there's the entrance.
So then we've got a bullet
In the floor, under him. This gun's got to be underneath him.
But I still don't see a gun. There's no gun under here.
Something's not right.
There's no way he killed himself if there's no gun.
Well, this just got unexpected.
911, what's the emergency?
My husband has been shot in the head. He's laying in the master bedroom on the floor.
What's your name?
My name's Annie Valvora.
Where is he in the house right now?
Just my son and I.
So do you believe that your son did this?
No. No, my son is 10 years old. It's okay, baby. It's okay. It'll be all right. Hang on.
I responded urgent status, which means lights and sirens. I was familiar with the house and was one of our former dispatchers at our communication center, but there was a handgun involved. So I asked dispatcher to have the reporting party step out to the front porch, and I wanted to see her hands.
Okay, well, can you actually step outside, make sure your hands are able to step out to the front porch for the police?
Yeah.
Once I saw her hands, I exited the vehicle. I asked her where her son is. I can see him on the couch. You just stay there with Mama, okay, buddy? When I walk in the doorway to the master bedroom, I can see a body laying on the floor, partially covered with blankets. But I could tell that he was deceased just due to discoloration on his limbs, the lividity, like the blood pooling. What's his name? Steven?
Yes.
Last name?
Olson.
If he's sleeping and someone else shot him, that's a weird position for his arm to be in.
He was located on the ground with his head laying on a body pillow, shot in the head. He was laying down in a face-down posture. His right arm was kinked up in a chicken wing fashion, his palm facing straight up.
There was brain matter that was outside of his head. He wasn't moving. He was cold, kind of stiffening up to the touch.
We treat every death as a suspicious death until proven otherwise. So with this case, it's either suicide or murder.
His name's Steven Olson. That's all I know. And I mean, he's got a flashlight.
He got a knife on his boot. Is that a holster?
Yeah, I'll bet you're right.
Okay.
The holster's empty.
This is weird.
The holster wasn't like a duty holster like I'm wearing, but he's wearing a brand of pant that are very common among law enforcement.
Is he a cop?
And so that made all of us think, okay, well, is he a police officer or what's he doing? And so as I'm looking at the body, and I'm assuming that this is a suicide, he put the gun to his head, and I'm assuming that the gun then fell and his body fell over the top of it.
And roll.
Yeah.
It does be the entry.
That looks like the exit to me.
Hold on, there's a hole right there.
Oh, you know what? That
Where's there a
pillow was
hole?
over his head.
Oh.
Yep. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, there's the entrance.
Oh, yep.
There was a large opening on the backside of the pillow. When you move the backside of the pillow down, there was blood spattering on a much smaller hole. I think in this particular situation, the pillow was wrapped up over his head and used for sound suppression.
So then we've got a bullet somewhere.
In the floor. Under him.
You have a channel to respond.
If he was laying on the floor when he did it.
And where the gun?
This gun's got to be underneath him.
There's a shell casing.
Yep.
There was a shell casing found near Steve Olson with a stamp on it for a FC-32 auto. It's difficult to make any conclusions based on the placement of any shell casings. We needed the firearm.
I still don't see a gun. There's no gun under here. Well, if there's no gun, then it's not.
Something's not right.
At that moment, there's an exclamation point that goes off in my head. Oh, all right, well, this is a problem. We need to find the gun to fill in the blanks and help us understand what happened there.
What do we have on tabletops? Anything interesting?
No, I didn't see If there was,
Nothing on the nightstands or...
bathroom over here. Do we know where the gun is?
Nope. I might
Did
as well
she
wait for
cover him
pictures.
with the towel?
I'll ask her if she covered him with a blanket. Did you find him with the blanket on him, or did you put the blanket on him?
I'm sorry.
Was the blanket on him, or did you put it there?
The blanket was
Okay. Can we put the dogs in the basement?
The house was chaotic, and the dogs are barking so loudly, and Anne was calm. Like, if I had just found a loved one shot in my bedroom, I would be hysterical.
You last saw it
about 1-ish. I went to bed. We were watching a movie. And
I didn't hear anything through the night.
How old are you now?
I'm 10.
10?
I didn't hear anything through the night until Mom woke me up.
Okay.
I didn't hear anything, but I take all my meds at night.
Were you sleeping in there?
I was sleeping right next to it in my bed.
In your bed?
Yeah. Then again, I take a handful of
So all three of you slept in that room last night?
Yeah. Okay. We were having movie night. But we crashed out before he did.
Okay. Well, just sit tight here. She's saying that all three of them slept in this room last night.
So she woke up and what?
You don't just walk by that.
No.
Well, has she moved anything?
No.
Because the blanket was covering him.
We still don't have a gun?
You want to come get some pictures?
Okay.
We might want to close that door. We don't want her to see this.
I don't want her son to see it either. Should I?
No.
She's saying that they all they were having a movie night. They were all cuddled in here in this room. They fell asleep before he did. But she's, I take lots of meds, so I didn't hear anything. But there's no way he killed himself if there's no gun.
And she shot him.
I don't know. I think she hid the gun somewhere.
Well, this just got unexpected.
There was no gun located within reach. Either he died by suicide and somebody moved the gun, or somebody shot him.
Speaking with Anne was a high priority. She's going to be the best one to tell us what actually did happen there.
Nice lady picked up the phone within the first ring.
We found out that Steve Olson had some involvement with law enforcement down in Des Moines, and he was a security guard up at Nebraska Medical Center. He worked double shifts in order to provide extra financial support to the family.
This officer came down and she told me that Steve was gone. My first thought was, I want him back. I want him back. I want my Steve. And it was hard to accept that he's gone. Steve grew up on the farm, and he graduated from high school and enlisted in the Army. He was a helicopter crew chief. A lot of his co-workers spoke about Steve and how friendly he was and how helpful he was, how courageous he was. And that reminds me every day of who he was and what he did.
Initially, when I approached Anne Balgora, we treat her as the reporting party. At the same time of being a reporting party, yes, she's also a potentially grieving widow that just lost her husband. And so there's a lot of delicate questions that are asked in order to, figure out as far as what had happened or what was going on.
This is definitely not the process right now for any night. As far as history with Stephen, had he made any comments about self-harm or wanting to hurt himself?
No, we were just trying to put things back together, deciding whether he was going to keep his lease at his apartment or because he was here most of the time anyway. We had separated just because he was drinking his, he drank heavily. And I said, look, if you're going to have a drink, I get it. And I said, but you can't Drink to intoxication every time.
Were you guys ever involved in any sort of physical altercation?
No.
Did he ever threaten violence, anything like that?
No, not towards himself.
What about just fights in general?
We argued about about how much money he spent on alcohol, considering there's other things, and that ties into the loony bit about the whole thing.
The loony bit? He would accuse you of being loony? Or...
Oh, no. I don't think he accused me of being loony. He knew I was a nut, but I'm a night. It's not that I'm a nut. I'm a night shifter.
Oh, okay.
And I did have acute anxiety. Yes, last year they were telling me I was absolutely loony, that I was, and the bottom line was, I have anxiety, acute anxiety disorder.
Ann was very willing to offer up a bunch of information about her ailments and numerous other things, but not necessarily any grief that took place in regards to Steve dying in the room that we were sitting next to. Obviously, we became more and more suspicious in regards to what had actually occurred in the bedroom.
You have 3 people in a room, 2 people walk out. So there is that external possibility that there was an intruder that came into the home. And then the only other possibility that Ann was responsible for it.
Okay, so you guys were watching the movie last night, and you said you crashed out during that.
Mm-hmm.
And then where was Steven at that
Steve
time?
he probably laid down to go to bed, I would imagine, at some point. I came out this morning and found the front door open and the screen door, and the alarm was not set.
And then about what time did you wake up?
About 2:15.
About 2:15 today?
Yeah.
Or 2:15 this afternoon, or 2:15?
2:15 today, this afternoon.
Okay.
Didn't know whether Steve had work at 3:30 or 4. And that's when I found the disaster.
So he was laying on the floor in the dark when you woke up?
Yes.
Any other incidents between you and Steve, and between Steve and maybe anyone else?
Not I'm aware of.
Okay.
I can't. I'm just.
Do you have any belief?
I'm sorry. I just can't even think straight right now.
She did not provide any names in regards to, I think Steve had a grief with this person, and I think you guys might want to go look at them right away. I found that extremely odd. The fact that she was not willing to come up with any sort of theory is obviously suspicious.
So you have the alarm system. Do you have any, like I have a Ring doorbell that takes video and stuff. Do you guys have anything like that?
So we put like a little one at the top of the steps.
Okay.
And so, I mean, it's just kind of an indoor camera, but...
Okay.
But I don't know if he had it on or not.
Oh, okay. When you found him today, was there a gun laying near him?
I didn't see it. I immediately looked over and I was like...
Would you have grabbed the gun and thrown it in a drawer so that he wouldn't see it?
No.
Okay.
I didn't even see the gun. I saw the head.
Right.
I was like, I threw the blanket over and I'm like, come on, buddy, we gotta come out of here. And he goes, what's wrong with Steve? And I said, well, there's something. I said, but you don't want to see this.
Mm-hmm.
I said, you don't need to see this.
And that was smart thinking.
Dispatcher for 10 years.
My police brain is just trying to fill in the blanks and come up with a story that makes sense. If he did it himself, since the gun is not underneath him, then Ann must have moved the gun somewhere. And there's probably a motivation for that. She's trying to protect her son from the gun, or that she hid the gun because she's afraid that if this is a suicide, that life insurance may not pay out.
I think your mom just arrived.
We were trying to get the son interviewed by a juvenile forensic interviewer. It's tragic for someone who's at such a young age to be able to now have to process that and compartmentalize that for the rest of his life.
Would it be able going in there with someone to get some clothes out of the closet for him to put on?
I'll go in with Sergeant McLennan and we'll see if we can find those for you.
Okay.
Just so that we can at least get that done.
Okay.
Okay.
And they have all their mirrors covered. What's the deal? Yeah, that's crazy.
Steven's sweatpants and I were like freak out.
Yeah. She seems remarkably unfreaked out.
I don't like to see.
Well, we're going to work through it a little bit at a time.
Maybe we can head on to the police department and we can continue our conversation. We're going to have the Douglas County Crime Labs going to come in on standard procedure. They come in and process the scene to make sure that we don't miss anything and that we get a full grasp as far as what's everything that's going on. Okay? The Douglas County Crime Lab was also responding to the scene in order to search through the rest of the house. There wasn't necessarily anything that we had concrete at that time. And so we're hoping to preserve any evidence that may be at the scene and at least collect a gunshot residue kit on Ann.
Do the same thing with your left palm.
Can I have one last cigarette before we go to the police department?
Can I smoke out here?
Thank you.
Yep, and we'll see you in a little bit, okay?
Okay. Just gonna have a cigarette quick.
Okay.
Sorry, I have a ton of stuff in here, so obviously I'm not gonna like handcuff you, but I will have you sit in back.
Okay.
And we're about the only people that fit comfortably. Little short girls.
Oh my God. No kidding. Okay.
When we arrived at the police department, I viewed Ann in a different light from when we initially responded to the call. Now she's a possible suspect. I thought I had a chance to, confront her with a much harder accusation.
There you go.
In order to elicit a response from that. I just want to make you aware, it's a voluntary interview. You don't have to answer any questions I have. You're free to leave at any point in time, okay?
Okay.
So with these general investigations, we go through a standard set of questions that we ask everybody. So the first question we always ask is, did you have any part in any involvement in Stephen's death?
Steve was very protective. Sorry. All through grade school up to high school, if he found out somebody was picking on me on the bus or anywhere, he was there, just leave her alone. It's my sister. He was there, always, just, he was a great brother.
I didn't do anything.
Okay. What occurred last night?
Yesterday, he worked evening shift. My son likes to wait up for Steve so we can have movie time and whatnot. And we were sitting in there and we were almost done watching the next one, and I'm just dead to the world.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm taking medication at night because I don't sleep well. That's why I've got to make sure everything is done in the house before I take my meds.
There's definitely an example of her taking one question and turning it into 3 or 4 different answers. I could see it as an attempt in order to list out the laundry list of everything else that's going on in order to avoid the actual investigation.
So I've got quite a few medical issues.
So where was your son sitting during these movies?
Next to me, most of the time, but I'm sure I fell asleep before he did. Because when I woke up, he was kind of snuggled in my arm. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I gotta get up. I was gonna look at the calendar and see what time I needed to wake Steve up. I'm like, honey, are you in there?
Mm-hmm.
And moved the pillow the blue and white pillow was like folded over his head, which was, it would never be like that. I'd never seen it like that way before. So I kind of flipped it back and gave him room, and of course let out this gush of and that's when I called, and I'm like, I called Mom. I said, start down this way. I need you down here right away. I said, I'm calling the police right now. I said, apparently something happened last night. Steve's been shot in the head.
She called her mom first. With her history of being a dispatcher, also an EMT, that struck us as very unique, very odd, very inconsistent with what most people would do if they just found their spouse, dead on the floor in front of their bed.
I said, I felt her heart, got no pulse. I said, it appears that rigor is setting in. And I said, I said, at this point, I said, Mom, he's gone. I said, there's no way. And she goes, okay, let me grab your sister, and we'll put that way. And at that point, I hung up with them, and I called 911.
Do you mind if I look at your phone just to see what the time frame was on that call?
Absolutely. Oh, here. And obviously, you can see I'm not a loon. I'm upset. And I'm sorry if I'm scattering a little. I think I'm just a little bit shocked. Ugh. I don't get it. I don't understand.
Tell me more about the rigor.
Rigor?
Yeah, as far as what you observed that led you to believe that.
I'm an EMT, but rigor when it gets hard.
Mm-hmm.
When the body gets hard and stiff.
Yeah, I know what it
Yeah.
is, but what did you observe on him that you observed as rigor?
So I tried to move him, and I of course touched his neck. There's nothing there. And I'm trying to see if there's anything. And he was just stiff. And, and hate to put it in ambulance code, but, DOA, but he was.
I've never heard anyone discuss a loved one's state of rigor when they've been found deceased. So the fact that she was using those terms to describe her husband is rather bizarre.
This situation, we have to kind of decipher on the spot. Is she trying to process? Is she trying to compartmentalize right now? Or is she just straight out lying to us?
Do you and Steven have any disputes?
We had problems, and we were doing so well with our problems. Mm-hmm. Our finances are a little bit foobarred right now. That's because I'm not working, obviously, and he is, he's the only income. He's got 2 places he's paying for, basically. And I don't even know. I know he's got an insurance policy somewhere, but I'd have to dig it up and dig it out and find out what it is. I don't know what it is, and I don't know who it's with.
She volunteers that there was a life insurance policy, and so you kind of start piecing together, okay, if she was got a financial benefit, that pointed the finger more towards Ann, that she was involved in it.
It was a leap forward in that process, down that path that established that Ann might have shot and killed Steve Olson.
I want to go ahead and backtrack as far as what occurred here. And how did you find the doors when you exited the room this morning, or this afternoon, I should say?
I came out and the alarm was not on. I thought, well, that's odd, and noticed that the front door was open like that far, about an inch. And the clicker for the screen on the door was open, in the open position. I wouldn't leave my house like that.
The clicker was open?
The screen lock.
Oh, okay, so for the storm door?
Yeah.
Out front?
Yeah, it was unlocked as well.
Outside of Ann's statements of the door was found open when she woke up in the morning and the storm door was unlocked, there was no indication in the house that somebody had entered the house or got involved in any sort of struggle. It becomes more and more likely that Ann was essentially covering up any involvement in it.
What happened after that?
So then I go in and I'm like, okay, it's time for you guys to get up. I walked over and I'm like, hey, loser. You're not supposed to sleep on the floor. Get up. Mm-hmm. And I said, it's almost 2:30 and I don't know when you work, so you need to get up.
Ann's behavior was just so odd. You kind of go, okay, is this somebody whose behavior and their speech and the manner that they're presenting themselves consistent with someone who just came upon their husband shot in the head?
And there was just no response at all. I just freaked out. And I couldn't go back in and look myself even. I didn't want to.
As far as he had a holster that was on him, does he normally always carry a gun? Did he have a gun on him last night?
He has a gun. Yeah, he usually carries.
Where would he have stored the gun? Where does he typically store the gun when he's sleeping?
At night?
Yeah.
He sleeps with it. It could be here, it could be there, it could be in his holster. I've seen him sleep with it laying right next to his hand. I've seen him laying on top of it. There's a smaller one that he leaves at home. It's a little Beretta. It's his. That's for in case of emergencies. And I have none. You want me to shoot an intruder if there's ever an intruder. But I said, I've taken that oath to heal. I said, I'm an EMT. Mm-hmm. I'm an EMT instructor. I said, I don't really want one. And I said, if you want to leave one up there, that's fine. Or leave it in the case or whatever. Make sure it's got a gun lock on it. I said, I don't care. It's nice to know that there's a weapon there that if any harm was to come to the child. But I told him I can't. I said I couldn't do that.
What else do you know about his other guns?
That's really all I know about his gun stuff. Because I don't like them. I've seen what they can do. So I'm really kind of an anti-gun person.
As far as her never being able to shoot an intruder, not having much contact with guns in the house, that clearly shows that she just wanted to really kind of distance herself from it. There's enough oddities in the conversation that we had already had that anything that Anna told me during that interview, I would have been extremely skeptical of.
And what do you think happened to the handgun?
I have no idea. I have no... I have no idea from the time I fell asleep to the time I got up and started running around and doing my thing, that anything had happened. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, I don't know what else to tell you.
Okay.
I mean, I just don't, because, like I said, I take these meds.
Did you know of anybody that he was having disputes with, anything along those lines?
He had disputes on a daily basis when he worked in the yard and stuff like that with people.
Anything that would have followed him home, no?
A couple. There were a few, especially with one particular one. You know, he says, I'll find where you live and I'll kill your family. First I'll kill your family and then I'll make it, and then I'll kill you. But you're no option. He had recent altercations that made threats. And so it's kind of one of those things of, I said, is there going to be a problem? But obviously that didn't take place. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. May he have made some friends or acquaintances? I would assume so. I have heard stories of
anybody he was in a business deal with, anything along those lines?
Not that I'm aware of.
We're going down the road of looking at a possible suspect. But there was nobody she suspected that broke into her house. There was just very little information that was offered up through that. I felt that we were going around in circles.
Would there be any reason why gunshot residue would show up on your hand?
No, unless it comes off on like the pillow or blanket that I lifted up or checked him for vitals.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the only reason.
Okay.
I don't know how that's transferred exactly, so I don't know if that counts or not.
Okay. I do have our forensic or computer forensics guy coming down.
Mm-hmm.
Would you consent for us doing an extraction on your cell phone? Just extraction, just look through it, make sure that everything matches up, see if there's any clues on that.
Oh, I don't care.
Okay.
Have it.
Okay.
It's a piece of crap.
Let me go and fill out that form
Okay.
so that we can get started on that, and then I'll be back in to check on you, okay?
She was not in custody at the time. And we had kind of reached a point where it was now important for us to, find out what her son said during his interview, and then also find out what exists in the form of physical evidence at the home. We contacted ADT, which was the security company that operated the security system within Ann Valgora's home. Anytime that front door was opened even an inch, the chimes for the doors announcing someone's arrival would have gone off, and also logged their entrance onto the security system logs. The security system had showed that the front door was closed all night and was not opened until Ann reported that she had woke the next day, which was contradictory to her statement that the door was open when she first awoke. It also showed that the security system had lost connectivity via the internet that had supported it for communication. But even if she were to unplug the internet to disable the security system, it's still going to communicate with ADT via cell signal.
Also, Ann told us there was a motion camera that was sitting up in the hallway of the second floor of the residence. It was an infrared camera that was motion activated. We were able to forensically examine that camera.
Later on that night, Steve is seen upstairs along with Ann's child. Appears to be checking the upstairs, and they walk through. At that point in time, Steve has a large handgun that's on his hip. Also, the camera scans across and shows a laundry pile that's located at the end of the hallway in front of the linen closet.
Hours later, when it activated itself again, based on motion, it showed that Andy walked through the camera, nude from the waist up, and we were able to discern that the laundry on the south end of the hallway had been moved and displaced.
Ann claimed that she had taken her nightly medication and that when she takes that, she's dead to the world, and she was sound asleep. She didn't hear anything. So that there's camera footage with Ann moving about through the upstairs indicates that wasn't true.
We were starting to dig through every single room upstairs. We were looking for any weapon that was capable of firing a .32 and every aspect of where we believe a gun could fit. And then in the laundry room, we were able to locate a .32 caliber Beretta upside down in the dryer. The same markings that were on the shell casings that were in the magazine of that Beretta was consistent to this casing that had already been fired. As soon as we found it, we deemed it this is the murder weapon. Finding the gun was a turning point. I believe that Ann took that upstairs after she took her clothes off because she was washing her clothes. I think that she washed the gun as well. Later in that day, we were able to find a Colt 45 in the upstairs laundry pile.
Comparison of that Colt 45 Commander along with the video of Steve upstairs at 1:30 a.m. It appears to be the handgun that he had on his hip when he was walking around the house at night.
I believe that she took that weapon off of him and then hid it, just possibly to throw us off.
Those interviewers are trained to make sure that they're not leading that child witness to an answer and really give them an opportunity to tell their side of the story and what they heard.
Ann Sun stated the night before, while Steve had fallen asleep, the gun that was located on Steve's hip had fallen out and onto the floor. At about 4 a.m., and that's when he had said that everything had gotten really weird.
He said Steven is kind of asleep on the floor at some point and snoring. And then her son reports that he heard a thud, kind of what he calls a silent gunshot.
And his mom told him that was nothing and he should go back to bed.
He also observed that Steve had stopped snoring. Based on everything that's happened up to this point, we came to the conclusion that Ann Valgora got up in the middle of the night, took a firearm out, went to the end of the bed, and killed Steve Olson.
The way everything appeared in the house. And then if you add that to the things that Ann's son said during his interview, at that point, I think law enforcement felt pretty confident that they had their suspect.
Ann had gone to her mother's house to stay for the evening. And so we had went out to the residence in order to make contact with her, informing her that, we needed to talk to her back at the police department to finish up some stuff.
Camera's already on the roll.
Okay. No. Just
We'll go over to this side, Ann. And hop in there. Put that seatbelt on for me. That'd be great.
All right. Your passenger seat empty?
Yes. Ready for you.
You didn't happen to pick up my medication, did you?
We did.
Oh, thank God. Oh. No, my head is pounding.
Ann seemed nonchalant, not necessarily worried, not asking questions, not saying, hey, did you get more information? Did you find out who did it?
So how long have you raised the Burmese mountain dogs?
Oh, God. This is my second set that I've retired. So, I want to say about 10 years.
We ended up having a 20-minute conversation about the Burmese mountain dogs that she was breeding in her home. And I definitely felt that she was avoiding anything that had to do with the case or what we were looking to discuss once we were back down at the police department.
If you want to have a seat in there again for me, can I get you a water or anything? You got that? Okay. Give me a bit and I'll be right in.
Okay.
This interview would include much more directed questions. We just need to understand the why and give her an opportunity to explain what caused her to do anything.
Okay. So obviously we went out to the house and we did a search warrant. I definitely think we have a better idea or a better picture as far as what happened.
Okay.
So after seeing everything, I'm just going to tell you, we found that you were responsible for Steven's death.
Okay. I'd like an attorney.
Okay. You want to stand up?
How could I'm just asking, in what way would I be responsible for it?
Well, we can't. You know, we can't have a further discussion with you if you've invoked your right and you'd like to speak with an attorney. So, we've stopped our interview, Ann.
Okay.
When anyone requests a lawyer when you're in that situation, you take it as a hit. But that evening, Ann was booked for second-degree murder and then lodged at the Sarpy County Jail.
A Papillion woman is in jail this evening, charged with murder.
And police just released the first details in the case this afternoon, and Sharon Chen is on the live desk with more.
Well, John and Lauren, we've learned that it was about 3:30 yesterday when Papillion police officers found Stephen Douglas Olson with a gunshot wound to the head. Officers arrested 49-year-old Anne Valgora. She is accused of second-degree murder with the use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony and also tampering with evidence. Valgora is set to appear before a judge tomorrow morning.
There was a jail call that she had made to a family member explaining that there was a life insurance policy on Steve, contrary to what she had explained to us in her interview.
You need to call his insurance company. It's going to be like New York Life. It's going to be one of those black tubs. And I don't know how that'll work and I would just say, look, he's passed away. She's in jail right now. And it will go to me directly as wife.
The life insurance policy was located in the black tote within the bedroom.
And what was discovered is that Stephen's life insurance policy had Anne as the 100% beneficiary of that. Also in text messages, she was kind of pressing Stephen to make sure that payments were made on his premium for that life insurance policy. Their finances were in a bad place. Their relationship in general just seemed to be so volatile. I don't know that the life insurance was the sole reason, but it does appear that it might have motivated her as well. She ultimately pled to first-degree assault, which sounds like a huge step down from first-degree murder. But in Nebraska, the potential sentence for first-degree assault is 50 years. So we knew that if she was willing to plead guilty to that, at her age, she'd be serving some pretty significant jail time. She was sentenced to 40 to 50 years in jail.
Obviously, it's important to seek justice for Steve Olson because at some level, he trusted Anne. And at some point in his life, he loved Anne enough that they got married. And she betrayed that trust in the most egregious way that someone can do that.
Steve was always so good. When I'd talk to him on the phone and I'd call him and talk to him for a while, and when we'd say goodbye, he'd always say, "Love you," you know.
It's been hard, but I still...
Mini đã nói. To understand the genesis of a monster, one must first walk through the grey, soot-stained streets of Neasden, a suburb of North London that in the late 1950s and early 1960s embodied the quiet, almost suffocating drudgery of post-war Britain. Neasden was a landscape of red brick semi-detached houses, each with its own small patch of garden and its own set of heavy lace curtains designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. This was a world of coal fires that left a gritty residue on the windowsills, of damp morning fogs that swallowed the silhouettes of the industrial factories lining the North Circular Road, and of a population that was still collectively exhaling after the trauma of the Blitz. The air was a thick mixture of diesel fumes, roasted hops from nearby breweries, and the omnipresent scent of wet wool and floor wax. In this environment, normalcy was not just a lifestyle, it was a defense mechanism. People kept their heads down, their lawns mowed, and their conversations limited to the weather or the price of tea. It was within this theater of the ordinary that the young family resided at number 60, Quainton Road, a house that looked exactly like its neighbors but pulsed with a different, colder energy. The setting of Graham Young's childhood was defined by a profound sense of displacement and a lack of emotional warmth that left a hollow space where his empathy should have grown. Born in 1947, just as the world was beginning to rebuild, Graham entered a life already marked by tragedy. His mother, Bessie, died of tuberculosis only months after his birth, a loss that fractured the family unit before it could even solidify. Graham was sent away to be raised by his Aunt Winnie, a woman who provided him with a sense of stability and affection that he would later find impossible to replicate. When his father, Fred, remarried a woman named Molly and called the boy back to Neasden at the age of 3, the transition was not a homecoming, but a rupture. To the young Graham, Molly was an intruder, a replacement for the mother he never knew and a rival for the attention of a father who was often distant, preoccupied with the grinding demands of his job at the local engineering works. The house on Quainton Road became a place of quiet friction, a domestic space where the air felt thin and the emotional stakes were perpetually low. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the cultural setting of Britain was undergoing a radical transformation, one that Graham would exploit with a chilling, precocious intelligence. This was the age of the white heat of technology, a time when science was heralded as the savior of the nation. For a boy like Graham, who found the social world of his peers confusing and beneath him, the world of chemistry offered a seductive, logical alternative. The setting of his youth was colored by the accessibility of lethal knowledge and materials that would be unimaginable in a later age. The local chemist shop was a place of wonder, a mahogany-lined sanctuary where a boy with a steady voice and a convincing story could purchase compounds that were essentially the building blocks of death. In an era where home science kits were encouraged as a way to foster the next generation of engineers, Graham found it remarkably easy to bypass the meager regulations of the time. He spent his hours in the local library, not reading adventure stories or romances, but poring over ancient, dust-covered volumes of toxicology and criminal history. He was a creature of the library stacks, a shadow moving through the history of human cruelty, finding kinship with the great poisoners of the Victorian era. The physical setting of his bedroom at 60 Quainton Road was a microcosm of his internal world. While other boys his age were pinning up posters of footballers or the latest rock and roll stars, Graham was constructing a clandestine laboratory. The room was a fortress of glass and chemicals, smelling of sulfur, ammonia, and the metallic tang of heavy salts. He kept his specimens in jars hidden under floorboards and behind books, a secret hoard that he tended to with the devotion of a priest. The house itself was small, with thin walls that allowed every sound to travel, the clinking of dishes, the low murmur of the television, the rhythmic snoring of his father. This proximity provided Graham with an intimate knowledge of his family's habits, a data set that he used to plan his experiments. He knew exactly when Molly would sit down for her afternoon tea, when his sister Winifred would reach for her water glass, and when his father would take his nightly medicine. The domestic routine was the conveyor belt upon which he delivered his doses, a mechanical, predictable system that he manipulated with a terrifying, detached curiosity. Beyond the walls of the house, the educational setting of Neasden provided Graham with a different kind of camouflage. At Neasden County Secondary School, he was seen as a brilliant but strange student, a professor in a school blazer who was too clever for his own good. His teachers noticed his aptitude for science, but failed to see the dark application to which he was putting his knowledge. He was a boy who could speak eloquently about the properties of antimony or the history of the Borgias, but who had no friends and no interest in the social rituals of the schoolyard. This isolation was a crucial part of his setting. It allowed him to view his peers and his family not as human beings, but as subjects in a vast, ongoing study. He was the observer, the one who stood outside the circle of human connection, watching the reactions of those he targeted with the cold, unblinking eye of a predator. The school, with its regimented schedules and its emphasis on rote learning, was merely a backdrop to his real education, which took place in the shadows of his room and the quiet corners of the chemistry lab. The broader historical setting of post-war Britain also played a role in shaping Graham's psyche. He grew up in a culture that was obsessed with the idea of the Superman, a lingering, dark fascination with the power and the cold efficiency of the Nazi regime that had so recently threatened the world. Graham found himself drawn to this ideology, not necessarily for its politics, but for its elevation of the intellectual elite over the common man. He saw himself as part of this elite, a man of science who is not bound by the pedestrian morality of the masses. He collected Nazi memorabilia and occult symbols, finding in them a reflection of his own desire for absolute power. This interest was a jarring contrast to the modest, middle-class aspirations of Neasden. While his neighbors were dreaming of new cars and washing machines, Graham was dreaming of a legacy written in the symptoms of the dying. The setting was one of profound duality, the sunny, hopeful optimism of the 1960s on the surface, and a deep, subterranean well of nihilism and cruelty underneath. The accessibility of chemicals in this era cannot be overstated. In the 1960s, a boy could walk into a hardware store and buy poisons for rats or garden pests that contained enough lethal material to wipe out a neighborhood. The local chemist was often a family friend, a man who would sell a bright, articulate boy a vial of antimony for a school project without a second thought. This ease of access was the oxygen that allowed Graham's obsession to breathe. He turned the very infrastructure of his community, the shops, the libraries, the schools, into his personal supply chain. He was a master of the long game, carefully accumulating his stores over months, testing small amounts on himself to understand the initial effects before turning his attention to others. The setting was a trap of innocence. The world was too unsuspecting to imagine that a 14-year-old could be calculating the LD50 of his own stepmother's evening meal. As the experiment in Neasden progressed, the atmosphere inside 60, Quainton Road became increasingly claustrophobic and thick with a pervasive, unnamed dread. Molly Young's health was failing in a way that baffled the local doctors, who saw her symptoms of vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating pain as a series of unrelated, unfortunate illnesses. This medical ignorance was another key part of the setting. In the early 1960s, diagnostic tools were limited, and the idea of a child poisoning his own family was so unthinkable that it simply wasn't on the table. The family lived in a state of constant, low-level panic, with the smell of sickness and the sound of Molly's moans becoming the new normal. Graham moved through this landscape of agony with a helpful, almost saintly demeanor, bringing cups of water and adjustment to pillows, his hands steady and his eyes watchful. He was the only one in the house who knew exactly what was happening, and that secret knowledge gave him a sense of godlike superiority that he found intoxicating. The geography of Neasden itself contributed to the sense of isolation. It was a suburb caught between the city and the country, a place of transit where people were constantly moving but never truly arriving. The proximity of the Wembley Stadium, with its roaring crowds and its massive, impersonal scale, served as a reminder of the world Graham was rejecting. He didn't want the roar of the crowd. He wanted the silence of the sickroom. He found the noise and the energy of the outside world chaotic and meaningless. He preferred the controlled, measured environment of the laboratory, where everything could be quantified and every action had a predictable reaction. This desire for control was the driving force behind his choice of poison as a weapon. A knife or a gun was messy and required a moment of direct, physical confrontation. Poison was elegant, invisible, and allowed the killer to remain at a distance, observing the results of his work without ever having to acknowledge the humanity of his victim. In the final months before his first arrest, the setting of Graham's life had become entirely subsumed by his obsession. He was no longer a schoolboy who liked chemistry. He was a poisoner who occasionally went to school. His journals were filled with hundreds of thousands of words detailing the exact dosages he was administering and the precise physiological responses of his family. The house on Quainton Road had become a living anatomical theater. The gray, damp climate of the London winter outside only mirrored the cold, stagnant air inside. The lack of light in the short December days meant that much of the drama took place in the shadows of the evening, by the flickering light of the coal fire or the dim glow of a bedside lamp. This was the world that Graham Young had created for himself, a world of bitter tastes, hidden vials, and the slow, deliberate extinguishing of life. The setting of Neasden, with its emphasis on keeping appearances and its deep-seated reluctance to confront the uncomfortable, provided the perfect cover for a monster to grow. If someone had bothered to look into the drawers of the quiet boy at number 60, if someone had questioned why he was so fascinated by the death of his mother, if the doctors had looked past the obvious and seen the patterns of the impossible, the tragedy might have been averted. But the setting was one of profound, collective blindness. The post-war world was so eager to move toward a bright, scientific future that it failed to see when that science was being turned into a tool of the most ancient and visceral darkness. Graham Young was a product of his time, a boy who took the tools of the modern age and used them to recreate the horrors of the past. As we move from the gray streets of Neasden to the clinical, high-security halls of Broadmoor, remember this setting. Remember the clink of the silver spoon, the smell of the damp fog, and the absolute, terrifying silence of a house where a boy was playing God with the lives of those who loved him. The experiment was well underway, and the next phase would be even more horrific than the last. This part 2 has laid out the environmental and psychological foundations of Graham Young's early life, emphasizing the contrast between the mundane suburb of Neasden and the dark, focused laboratory of his mind. The pacing was kept slow and descriptive, using show, don't tell, to illustrate the atmosphere of the 1950s and 60s. The detail of the chemical accessibility and the medical ignorance of the time were highlighted to explain how he was able to operate for so long. To look upon the victims of Graham Young is to witness the slow, agonizing erasure of human identity, where the vibrant complexity of a person is systematically reduced to a series of checkmarks in a hidden notebook. For Graham, these individuals were never truly people with dreams, fears, or families. They were merely biological substrates, the medium through which he could observe the fascinating mechanics of chemical destruction. To understand the depth of this horror, we must first look at Molly Young, the woman who had the misfortune of stepping into the role of a stepmother. Molly was a woman of simple, earnest warmth, a person who entered the household on Quainton Road with a genuine desire to mend a fractured family and provide a sense of maternal stability to a boy she believed was merely shy and intellectually gifted. She was the heart of the home, the one who kept the kettle whistling and the table set, unaware that her very acts of service were being weaponized against her. The portrait of Molly's decline is a visceral study in chemical corrosion. She began as a healthy, bustling woman of her time, but under Graham's ministrations, she was transformed into a shadow. It started with subtle, unexplained twinges, a sudden sharp pain in the abdomen after a Sunday roast, a lingering nausea that the local doctor dismissed as mere nerves. As the months of 1961 progressed, the poison, likely antimony administered in rhythmic, calculated doses, began to hollow her out from the within. We see her standing at the kitchen sink, her hands once steady and capable, now trembling so violently that she shatters a saucer. We see the once vibrant color of her skin fading into a translucent, waxy pallor, as if she were being slowly turned into a museum specimen while still breathing. Her hair, which she used to brush with such pride, began to fall out in dry, brittle clumps, littering the pillowcases of her sickbed. Graham would observe these manifestations with a terrifying, detached focus, noting the exact timing of her tremors and the specific shade of her jaundice. He was the one who would bring her a soothing cup of tea when she was too weak to stand, his eyes fixed on her face to catch the exact moment the liquid crossed her lips. Molly's death in April 1962 was not an ending for Graham, but a successful conclusion to an experiment. She died in excruciating pain, her body racked by convulsions that mimicked the symptoms of natural disease so perfectly that she was buried without an autopsy, her humanity discarded like a used-up vial in a laboratory. The portrait of victimization then extends to Fred Young, Graham's own father. Fred was a man of the post-war working class, a sturdy individual whose life was defined by the clatter of the engineering works and the quiet pride of providing for his family. After the loss of his wife, Fred became the subject of his son's growing arrogance. The betrayal here was not just physical, but foundational. Fred trusted his son. He saw Graham's interest in chemistry as a mark of a bright future, never imagining that the boy was testing his formulas on the very man who bought the bread. Fred's descent was marked by a chilling confusion. He was a man who prided himself on his strength, yet he found himself suddenly unable to climb the stairs, his legs feeling like lead, his lungs burning with every breath. He spent months in a state of perpetual, agonizing sickness, his body a battlefield for the chemicals Graham slipped into his food and drink. The tragedy of Fred Young lies in the eyes of a father who looks at his son and sees a caregiver, never realizing he is staring into the eyes of his executioner. Fred survived, but he emerged from the ordeal a broken man, his health permanently compromised and his spirit shattered by the eventual realization that the monster had been nurtured under his own roof. When the narrative shifts to 1971, the landscape of victimization moves from the domestic to the industrial. At John Hadland's photographic laboratories in Bovingdon, we encounter Bob Eggle, a 59-year-old storeman who would become the first fatal subject of Graham's adult spree. Bob was a veteran, a man of routine and reliable kindness who had spent his life in the service of his community and his family. He was the kind of colleague who was always ready with a smile and a hand in the storeroom. When Graham Young was hired as a store's clerk, Bob welcomed him with the unsuspecting warmth of an older mentor. The portrait of Bob Eggle's final months is a harrowing account of the Bovingdon bug, a mysterious illness that swept through the office, but which targeted Bob with a singular, lethal intensity. We see Bob, a once robust man, suddenly doubled over in the storeroom, his face contorted in a mask of agony that no one could explain. The thallium Graham administered was a perfect poison for his needs. It was tasteless, odorless, and its symptoms were a cruel mimicry of 1,000 other ailments. Bob's decline was an agonizingly slow process of atrophy. His hair fell out, his feet became so sensitive that even the weight of a bedsheet caused him to scream in pain, and his internal organs began to shut down one by one. Graham, playing the role of the concerned friend, would visit him, bringing news from the office and, occasionally, the very drinks that were ensuring Bob would never return. The horror is found in the intimacy of the deathbed. Bob Eggle died in July 1971, a man who believed he was suffering from a rare, tragic virus, never knowing that his bright, new colleague was recording every stage of his death with a fountain pen and a satisfied smirk. For the Eggle family, the loss was a senseless, sudden void, a theft of a grandfather and a husband that left them searching for answers in a world that seemed to have gone mad. Then there was Fred Biggs, a 47-year-old local favorite, a man of vitality and a deep love for his garden and his family. Fred was the second fatal victim of the Bovingdon experiments, and his story is perhaps the most excruciating to recount. Unlike Bob Eggle, who died relatively quickly once the heavy doses began, Fred Biggs' body fought the poison with a desperate, tragic tenacity. He was a man in the prime of his life, a father whose presence was a constant source of joy for his children. When the bug hit him, it didn't just make him sick, it dismantled him. We see Fred in a hospital bed, his nervous system on fire, his mind clear even as his body failed him. The thallium caused a condition known as burning feet syndrome, a pain so intense it was described as having boiling oil poured over the skin. Fred Biggs spent weeks in this state of living hell. He lost his speech, his ability to swallow, and eventually his sight. His wife sat by his side, watching as the man she loved was reduced to a weeping, paralyzed shell of his former self. Graham Young's reaction to Fred Biggs' suffering was the ultimate show, don't tell, of his psychopathy. While the rest of the office was in a state of mourning and fear, Graham was complaining about the dullness of the situation and the lack of progress in the medical diagnosis. He even went so far as to suggest to his colleagues that Fred was unlikely to recover, a prediction he made with the chilling certainty of a man who had already decided the outcome. Fred Biggs died in November 1971, his death a protracted, visceral nightmare that left the Bovingdon community paralyzed with a nameless dread. The portrait of Fred is one of a life stolen by degrees, a man who was used as a biological yardstick to measure the potency of a heavy metal. Beyond the fatalities, there were the sickly colleagues, men like Jethro Batt and Peter Buck, who survived Graham's experiments but were left with scars that would never heal. They were the background radiation of his malice. They were the men who felt off for months, the ones who suffered from unexplained tremors, the ones who woke up in cold sweats, and the ones who found their hair thinning in their 20s. Their victimization was a form of gaslighting. They were told they were overworking, that they were catching a local flu, or that it was all in their heads. They lived in a state of constant, low-level toxicity, their bodies struggling to filter out the small, experimental doses Graham was testing on the collective. The atmosphere in the Hadland storeroom became one of profound, unspoken suspicion. Men began to watch their tea mugs, to question the taste of a biscuit, and to look at each other with narrowed eyes. Graham had successfully poisoned not just their bodies, but the very air of camaraderie that made their workplace a community. The portrait of the victims must also include the families, the wives who became nurses overnight, the children who watched their fathers wither away, and the sisters who lived with the guilt of surviving when others did not. Winifred Young, Graham's sister, lived with the memory of the bitter tea that had made her so ill years before, a memory that would later become a terrifying realization of how close she had come to her own end. The psychological victimization was a slow-acting poison in itself. The families of Bovingdon were left to wonder why their loved ones had been chosen, why the bug had struck their house and not the one next door. They lived in a world where the most basic act of human kindness, serving a drink, had been turned into a lethal gamble. The trauma of the Teesside poisoner was a generational one, a ripple of grief and suspicion that moved through the village of Bovingdon and the suburbs of Neasden, staining the memories of every shared meal and every afternoon break. To see the victims clearly, we must look at the artifacts of their lives that Graham recorded in his diary. He didn't write about Bob's love for his garden or Fred's laugh. He wrote about Subject A's pulse rate and Subject B's reaction to 0.5 grams of thallium. He stripped them of their names and replaced them with letters of the alphabet. This was the ultimate violation. He took their suffering, the most intimate and vulnerable experience a human can have, and turned it into a cold, academic footnote. The victims of Graham Young were the martyrs of a private, nihilistic religion of science. They were the people who paid the price for a world that was too unsuspecting to believe that a quiet, intelligent man could be a predator of the most clinical sort. In the end, the portrait of the victims is a mosaic of loss. It is the image of Molly's empty chair at the dinner table, the sound of Fred Bigg's silent house, and the sight of Bob Eggles and used tools in the storeroom. It is the collective memory of a community that realized, far too late, that the most dangerous person in the room was the one who was most eager to pour the tea. The victims were the ordinary people of an ordinary world, caught in the sights of a man who saw the world through a periodic table. Their stories are a reminder of the fragility of the human body and the terrifying power of a mind that has entirely detached itself from the concept of empathy. As we transition from the portraits of the lost to the incident that would finally bring the experiments to a close, we carry the weight of these names, Molly, Bob, Fred, as a shield against the cold, clinical indifference of the man who sought to erase them. Their lives were more than data points. They were the heartbeat of a community that Graham Young tried, but ultimately failed, to silence. The horror of Bovingdon did not arrive with a thunderous roar or a visible shadow. It seeped into the sterile, industrial atmosphere of John Hadland's photographic laboratories like a slow-moving, invisible gas. When Graham Young walked through those doors in May 1971, he was carrying more than just his lunch and a desire for a fresh start. He was carrying a decade of refined malice and a rucksack filled with the very poisons that had once sent him to the darkest wards of Broadmoor. The office in Bovingdon was a place of efficiency and camaraderie, a typical British workplace of the early 70s where the clatter of typewriters and the hum of machinery were the soundtrack to the day. The workers there were hard-working, unsuspecting, and deeply rooted in the traditional rituals of the office, the most sacred of which was the morning and afternoon tea round. To them, the new store's clerk was a quiet, almost spectral presence, a man who spoke in a modulated, scholarly tone and who seemed remarkably eager to assist with the mundane chores that others avoided. They saw his willingness to take over the tea trolley as a sign of helpfulness, a way for the new boy to integrate into the team. They had no way of knowing that they were handing the keys to their lives to a man who viewed their bodies as nothing more than test tubes. The incident began as a subtle, creeping malaise that the employees jokingly christened the Bovingdon bug. It started with Bob Eggle, the 59-year-old storeman who had been the first to show Graham the ropes. Bob was a man of iron constitution, rarely sick and always reliable, but within weeks of Graham's arrival, he began to complain of a strange, tingling sensation in his fingertips and a persistent, dull ache in his stomach. Graham watched him with a terrifying, unblinking focus. Every time Bob reached for his mug of tea, Graham's eyes would narrow slightly, tracking the movement of the liquid, observing the way Bob's hand began to tremble. The show, don't tell, of Graham's malice was found in the small, hidden gestures. While the rest of the staff expressed concern for Bob's health, Graham was in the storeroom, hunched over his private diary, recording the exact dosage of thallium he had slipped into Bob's beverage and the precise minute the first symptoms of nausea appeared. He didn't just want Bob to be ill, he wanted to witness the systematic breakdown of his nervous system. He watched as Bob's once brisk walk slowed to a painful shuffle, his face taking on a grayish, translucent hue that made him look like a ghost long before he actually died. The tea rounds became a theater of the macabre. Imagine the scene: the rattling of the trolley, the clink of the heavy ceramic mugs, and the steam rising in the cool morning air of the warehouse. Graham would stand over the kettle, his movements precise and rhythmic. He would reach into his pocket, his fingers brushing against a small glass vial containing thallium, a heavy metal that is tasteless, odorless, and utterly lethal. With the practiced ease of a master chef, he would dispense a measured amount into a specific cup, his face a mask of polite indifference. He knew exactly who was getting which dose. He was playing a lethal game of Russian roulette, but he was the one who decided where the bullet was lodged. He would walk through the office, handing out the drinks with a small, helpful nod, watching as his colleagues took their first sips. He was looking for the bitter taste reflex, the slight twitch of a nose or a furrowed brow that signaled the poison was making its presence known. To Graham, the office was no longer a place of work. It was a grand, unfolding experiment, and his colleagues were the subjects who were providing him with the data he had craved since his release. By June, the Bovingdon bug was no longer a joke. It was a source of profound, unspoken anxiety. More and more staff members were falling ill with a bizarre array of symptoms that defied medical explanation. Jethro Batt, another storeman, began to suffer from excruciating pains in his legs and a strange, patchy hair loss that left him looking ravaged and old before his time. Peter Buck, a young technician, found himself unable to focus, his vision blurring and his stomach knotted with a persistent, burning agony. The atmosphere in the laboratory shifted from one of productivity to one of suspicion and fear. People began to watch their own mugs, to question the taste of the sugar, and to look at the new boy, Graham, with a mixture of confusion and unease. But Graham was a master of the double bluff. He would sit in the canteen, sipping his own untainted tea, and discuss the bug with an air of clinical concern. He would suggest that perhaps it was something in the water pipes, or a rare virus brought back by someone from a holiday. He was gaslighting an entire company, using his superior intellect to keep them trapped in a cycle of sickness and uncertainty. The peak of the horror was the agonizing decline of Fred Biggs. Fred was a man of 47, a father and a well-liked member of the Bovingdon community. He was the next primary subject in Graham's notebook. The poisoning of Fred Biggs was a visceral, protracted symphony of suffering. Graham began with small, acclimation doses, watching as Fred started to complain of the burning feet syndrome that is the hallmark of thallium poisoning. It is a pain so intense that it is described as having molten lead poured over the skin. We see Fred at his desk, his brow beaded with sweat, his hands gripped white-knuckled around the edges of his chair as he tries to fight through the waves of fire coursing through his nerves. Graham would stand nearby, ostensibly checking a stock list, but in reality, he was conducting a psychological autopsy. He wanted to see how much a man could endure before his mind broke. He recorded the loss of Fred's hair, the way his voice became a raspy, painful whisper, and the moment his sight began to fail. Graham's diary from this period is a chilling testament to his lack of humanity. He describes Fred's agony with the same detached interest a child might show when pulling the wings off a fly. The incident was not just the physical act of poisoning, but the psychological warfare Graham waged on his victims. He would visit them in the hospital, standing over their beds with a look of simulated pity. He would bring them small gifts, perhaps a magazine or a piece of fruit, while secretly reveling in the fact that he was the reason they were there. He was the god of their world, the one who held the power of life and death in a tiny glass vial. When Bob Eggle finally succumbed to the poison in July, Graham's reaction was the ultimate betrayal. At Bob's funeral, Graham stood among the grieving family, his face a picture of somber respect. But later, he remarked to a colleague that it was a shame Bob had been cremated, as it made a proper toxicological analysis impossible. He was so arrogant, so intoxicated by his own cleverness, that he was beginning to drop the mask. He was a man who felt he was playing a game with the world, and he was winning. The Bovingdon bug was his masterpiece, a visceral, ongoing demonstration of his scientific prowess. As the months rolled into the autumn of 1971, the situation at John Hadlands reached a breaking point. Nearly 70% of the staff had been affected by the bug at some point. The local doctors were baffled, and the company was on the verge of a total shutdown. The air in the office was heavy with the smell of sickness and the stagnant energy of a community under siege. Graham, however, was in a state of high-functioning euphoria. He was the only one who was never ill. He was the only one whose energy never flagged. He was the one who was always ready with a fresh pot of tea, his hands steady and his eyes bright. The show, don't tell, of his invincibility was a beacon of guilt that should have been obvious, but the people of Bovingdon were blinded by their own decency. They couldn't conceive of a person who would do this. They were looking for a virus, a bacteria, a faulty drain, anything but a man with a chemistry set and a notebook. The incident reached its final, critical phase when Graham's arrogance finally overcame his caution. He began to intervene in the medical discussions, offering expert opinions to the company doctor and the visiting specialists. He asked why they hadn't considered thallium poisoning, discussing the rare metal with a depth of knowledge that was far beyond what a store's clerk should possess. He was like a magician who was so bored with his audience's inability to see the trick that he started pointing out the trapdoor. He would stand in the office and talk about the lethal dosages of heavy metals with a disturbing enthusiasm, his eyes lit with a manic, intellectual fire. This was the moment the incident transitioned from a secret experiment to a public challenge. Graham was no longer content with being the invisible killer. He wanted to be the recognized master. He wanted the world to see the genius behind the Bovingdon bug. The atmosphere in the laboratories during those final weeks was like a pressure cooker. The staff were on edge, jumpy, and increasingly hostile toward each other. The camaraderie had been replaced by a thin, brittle politeness. People were bringing their own flasks of water from home, refusing to touch the office tea. The supply room, where Graham reigned supreme, was seen as a place of shadows and secrets. The smell of the chemicals used in the photographic process, the silver nitrates and the fixing agents, seemed to take on a more sinister, metallic quality. Every sound, every clatter of a bottle, felt like an accusation. And in the center of it all sat Graham Young, his pen scratching against the pages of his diary, recording the final, agonizing breaths of Fred Biggs. He was a man who had turned a small Hertfordshire village into a private laboratory, and he was waiting for the final result of his grand experiment. The horror of Fred Biggs' final days is a visceral memory for those who survived Bovingdon. He was a man being burned alive from the inside out. His screams could be heard through the hospital walls, a sound of primal, unadulterated suffering that haunted the nurses. Graham heard those stories and merely noted that the subject's resilience was higher than expected. He was disappointed that the death was taking so long. He was already planning his next move, thinking about how he could refine the dosage to achieve a more efficient result next time. The incident was not a momentary lapse or a fit of rage. It was a sustained, calculated, and deeply enjoyed campaign of slaughter. It was the realization of Graham Young's lifelong dream, to be a master of death, a man who could command the very elements to do his bidding. The Bovingdon bug was a tragedy of trust. It was a massacre conducted in the most domestic and mundane of settings. It was the poisoning of a community's spirit as much as its body's. As we look at the timeline of those 6 months in 1971, we see a man who found liberation in the destruction of others. We see the tea rounds, the small smiles, the hidden vials, and the scratching pen. We see the faces of Bob and Fred as they realized, too late, that their friend was their executioner. The incident at Bovingdon remains one of the most chilling chapters in the history of British crime, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones who lurk in the dark, but the ones who hand you a cup of tea in the bright light of a Wednesday morning. Graham Young was a man who looked at a human life and saw only a chemical reaction, and for 6 months in a quiet village, he was allowed to play God. The steam from the kettle was the smoke from his battlefield, and the silence of the office was the silence of the grave. The experiment was coming to its horrific conclusion, and the world was finally about to learn the name of the man who had turned a photographic lab into a slaughterhouse. The pacing of the murders was a deliberate crescendo. Graham was testing the waters with the smaller, non-lethal poisonings of Jethro Bat and others, building his confidence before moving to the main events. He was a composer of agony, arranging the symptoms and the suffering until they reached a pitch of absolute horror. The show, Don't Tell, was found in the varying levels of sickness across the office. It was a map of Graham's interests and his whims. Some were given just enough to make them feel a constant, gnawing dread. Others were marked for the final experiment. The randomness was a strategy, a way to keep the authorities guessing and to ensure that the bug remained a mystery. It was a masterpiece of cold, clinical manipulation, and as the sirens finally began to converge on the Bovingdon laboratories, Graham Young sat at his desk, his hands steady, his notebook closed, and a small, satisfied smile playing across his lips. The incident was over, but the echoes of the screams from the hospital would ring for a lifetime. Graham's final act of arrogance at Bovingdon was the helpful suggestion that eventually led to his undoing. He couldn't resist showing off. He was like a killer who leaves a signature at the scene of the crime because the crime itself isn't enough. He needs the world to know it was him. He stood in that office, surrounded by the ghosts of the men he had killed, and spoke of thallium with a familiarity that was his own confession. The show, Don't Tell, of his guilt was his inability to hide his genius. He was a man who loved poison more than he loved himself, and in the end, it was that love that would bring him down. The incident at Bovingdon was the final proof that Graham Young was a monster of the most modern and most terrifying kind, a man who used the progress of science to satisfy the most primitive of urges. The tea was served, the poison was taken, and the story of the Bovingdon bug was finally, tragically, written in the blood of the innocent.
Gemini đã nói.
The gray, frost-bitten morning of November 1971 in the village of Bovingdon did not feel like the setting for a historic breakthrough, but rather like the final, exhausted breath of a community that had been systematically hollowed out by a phantom. At the John Hadland Laboratories, the atmosphere was thick with a paranoia that was almost physical, a heavy, cold fog that seemed to seep through the window frames and settle in the lungs of every remaining employee. The Bovingdon bug was no longer a mystery to be joked about. It was a visceral, terrifying reality that had already claimed the life of Bob Eggle and was currently dismantling Fred Biggs in a hospital bed miles away. The discovery did not begin with a dramatic police raid, but with a series of small, unsettling shifts in the medical narrative, led by the growing frustration of the company doctor, Ian Anderson. Dr. Anderson sat in his office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead with a clinical, maddening persistence, staring at the health records of his staff. The patterns made no sense. He saw a landscape of diverse symptoms: numbness, vomiting, hair loss, excruciating nerve pain, that defied any singular viral or bacterial explanation. The discovery was born from the realization that the environment itself was not the enemy. The water was clean, the ventilation was modern, and the chemicals used in the photographic processes were handled with standard safety protocols. The enemy, the doctor began to suspect, was something more intimate, something that moved within the social rituals of the office. The first tangible clue, the one that would eventually bring the entire house of cards crashing down, was Graham Young's own insatiable need for intellectual recognition. During a tense staff meeting convened to discuss the ongoing health crisis, the silence of the room was punctured by Graham's voice, a voice that was too calm, too modulated, and far too knowledgeable. While the other employees sat with hunched shoulders and worried eyes, Graham leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled with the practiced air of a senior consultant. He began to ask questions that were not the questions of a store's clerk. He spoke of the synergistic effects of heavy metals and the characteristic symptoms of thallium toxicity. He pointed out, with a chillingly helpful smile, that the burning feet syndrome being suffered by Fred Biggs was a textbook manifestation of thallium poisoning. The show, don't tell, of his guilt was the sheer specificity of his information. Dr. Anderson watched him, noting the way Graham's eyes lit up when he discussed the lethal properties of rare elements. It wasn't the look of a worried colleague. It was the look of an artist explaining his masterpiece to a critic who was too slow to understand the technique. This intellectual arrogance was the crack in the mask. The doctor's intuition, honed by years of practice, shifted from medical concern to a cold, creeping suspicion. He realized that the quiet, brilliant young man knew too much about the very thing that was killing his friends. Following that meeting, the gears of the investigation began to grind with a sudden, sharp urgency. Dr. Anderson made a discreet phone call to the police, and the inquiry was handed to Detective Superintendent Christopher Pollard. The first breakthrough of the investigation was not forensic, but administrative. When Pollard pulled Graham Young's file, the revelation was like a physical blow. The store's clerk, who had been serving tea to his colleagues for 6 months, was actually a convicted mass poisoner, a man who had been sent to Broadmoor at the age of 14 for nearly killing his father and sister and for the suspected murder of his stepmother. The shock that rippled through the police headquarters was visceral. The discovery that the state had released a predatory chemist back into an unsuspecting community without a single warning to his employers was a failure of such magnitude that it momentarily paralyzed the investigators. They realized that the Bovingdon bug was not a virus, it was a man. The discovery changed the nature of the scene from a medical mystery to a high-stakes crime scene. Every cup, every kettle, and every teaspoon in the Hadland laboratories was now a potential murder weapon. The arrival of the CID at Bovingdon was a quiet, somber affair, conducted under the cover of a renewed health inspection to avoid tipping off the suspect. The investigators moved through the laboratories with a suppressed energy, their eyes scanning the mundane objects of the office, the sugar bowls, the coffee tins, the half-finished jars of mustard in the canteen. They were looking for the invisible. The physical discovery of the scene was the realization that the entire workplace had been turned into a laboratory of death. The forensics team, led by specialists in toxicology, began to collect samples of everything. They scraped the residue from the bottom of the communal tea urn and swabbed the handles of the lockers. The smell of the office, the mixture of developer chemicals and stale biscuits, now carried the weight of a cemetery. But the most significant discovery awaited them in the quiet, rented room where Graham Young spent his solitary nights. The search of Graham's lodgings was a descent into the mind of a monster. As the detectives forced the lock and stepped into the small, cramped space, they were met with a sight that defied the domestic normalcy of the village. The room was a shrine to lethal science. The air was stagnant, smelling of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of chemical salts. On the desk, neatly organized, were bottles and vials of substances that had no place in a residential home: antimony, thallium, and various alkaloids. But the centerpiece of the discovery, the smoking gun that would seal Graham's fate, was a small, black-bound notebook. This was the poisoner's diary, a document of such cold-blooded depravity that it left the investigating officers in a state of stunned silence. Written in Graham's meticulous, flowing hand, the diary was a day-by-day account of the Bovingdon experiments. It was a ledger of agony. He didn't use names. He used initials or Subject 1 and Subject 2. He recorded the exact dosages he had administered, the precise times of ingestion, and a clinical analysis of the victim's suffering. He wrote about Bob Eggel's satisfactory decline and Fred Biggs' resilient but ultimately failing system. The discovery of this diary transformed the victims from statistics back into people who had been systematically tortured for the amusement of a ghost. The show, don't tell, of the diary was the absolute lack of emotion. There was no hate, no anger, only the terrifyingly calm observation of a scientist watching a chemical reaction. As the physical evidence was being catalogued in Bovingdon, another gruesome discovery was being made in a graveyard miles away. The police realized that to prove their case, they needed the testimony of the dead. They ordered the exhumation of Bob Eggel, who had been buried months earlier. The scene at the cemetery was a visceral tableau of true crime reality. Under the glare of portable floodlights, in the damp, midnight chill of a Hertfordshire winter, the sound of the backhoe hitting the earth was the only break in the silence. The investigators stood in a circle, their breath blooming in the cold air, as the coffin was slowly raised from the mud. It was a moment of profound, heavy somberness. When the body was finally analyzed by the Home Office pathologists, the results were undeniable. Even after months in the earth, Bob Eggles' remains were saturated with thallium. The poison was there, a silent, indestructible witness to the betrayal he had suffered. The discovery was complete. The bug had a name, a method, and a motive that was no motive at all. The final phase of the discovery was the interrogation of Graham Young himself. When the police finally moved to arrest him, they found him in a state of arrogant, almost amused calm. He didn't struggle. He didn't protest his innocence with the heat of a wrongly accused man. Instead, he treated the arrest as a peer-to-peer discussion between intellectuals. The show, don't tell, of his interaction with the police was his refusal to stop being the professor. Even in the back of the police van, he couldn't help but comment on the inefficiency of their procedures or the lack of scientific rigor in their initial questioning. When they found a lethal dose of thallium hidden in the lining of his coat, a suicide pill he claimed was for himself, but which he would have likely used on another, he merely smiled. He was a man who believed he was untouchable because he was smarter than the world around him. But the discovery of his diary had stripped away his invisibility. The master of the invisible kill was now standing in the bright, unforgiving light of a forensic investigation. Back at the Hadland Laboratories, the discovery of the truth brought a different kind of horror to the survivors. The realization that their helpful colleague had been the one pouring the poison into their mugs was a psychological trauma that surpassed the physical sickness. The canteen, once a place of laughter and gossip, was now a site of desecration. They remembered the times Graham had held the door for them, the times he had brought them a glass of water when they were feeling under the weather, and the way he had listened to them talk about their families. Every memory was now tainted, a poisoned well of human connection. The discovery was not just of a crime, but of a total, nihilistic betrayal of the social contract. They realized they had been living with a predator who didn't want their money or their jobs, but their very life force, consumed one measured dose at a time. The atmosphere of the village of Bovingdon changed overnight. The quiet, safe streets now felt like a hunting ground where the monster could look like anyone. The sensory details of the discovery phase were defined by the cold, the sharp smell of chemicals, and the rustle of paper. The investigators worked in a landscape of gray winter skies, gray industrial walls, and the gray ash of the fire, where Graham had tried to burn the last of his notes. They found fragments of charred paper in the grate of his room, the edges curled and blackened, but with words like lethal and thallium still visible in the center. These fragments were the last gasps of a secret that refused to stay buried. The discovery was a mosaic of these tiny, horrific pieces, fit together by the relentless focus of the police and the medical experts. It was a process of taking the Bovingdon bug and stripping away its mythical, frightening mask to reveal the small, hollow man underneath, a man who thought he was a god because he knew how to use a dropper and a vial. As the evidence was finalized for the trial, the magnitude of the discovery became a national scandal. The Teesside poisoner was back, and the question of how he had been allowed to strike again was a firestorm that threatened to consume the mental health and prison systems of the country. The discovery had revealed not just one man's depravity, but a systemic blindness that had allowed a wolf to be placed back in the fold. The victims' families stood in the center of this storm, their grief now sharpened by the knowledge that their loved ones' deaths had been entirely preventable. The discovery phase ended not with a sense of peace, but with a heavy, aching realization of the cost of innocence. The bug was gone, the vials were in evidence bags, and the black notebook was in a safe. But the silence in Bovingdon was now the silence of a town that would never truly trust a cup of tea again. The final image of the discovery is the black-bound diary sitting on a velvet cloth in the evidence room. It is a small, unremarkable object that holds the weight of multiple lives. It is the physical manifestation of Graham Young's soul, ordered, clinical, and completely devoid of light. Beside it sits the silver spoon from the Bovingdon canteen, polished for the cameras, but still carrying the invisible echo of the clinks against the china. The discovery was the bridge between the nightmare and the reckoning, a moment where the world finally caught up to the monster and forced him to look at the wreckage he had made. The path from the bug to the poisoner was complete, and the stage was now set for the final confrontation in the courtroom, where the justice of the system would attempt to answer for the lives that had been treated as nothing more than variables in a lethal equation. This part of the narrative has captured the visceral, clinical, and urgent nature of the breakthrough, moving from the doctor's initial suspicion to the horrific contents of the diary and the exhumation of the dead. The show, don't tell, technique was used to illustrate Graham's arrogance and the chilling atmosphere of the investigation. The discovery was not just of the crime, but of the man behind the mask and the devastating impact of that realization on the survivors and the nation. The primary investigation into the dark, chemical legacy of Graham Young did not simply conclude with the discovery of his black-bound diary at Bovingdon. Rather, it expanded into a sprawling, frantic search through the shadows of the previous decade, a journey that led the detectives of the CID into a series of agonizing and labyrinthine dead ends. As Detective Superintendent Christopher Pollard sat in the dimly lit incident room at Hemel Hempstead, the air was thick with more than just the smell of stale tobacco and burnt coffee. It was thick with the realization that the Teesside poisoner had been a free man for 9 months before arriving at John Hadland's laboratories, and during that time, he had been a ghost moving through a world of unsuspecting victims. The investigation now faced its most daunting task, mapping the missing years of a man who viewed human life as a series of data points. Every file they opened seemed to lead to another wall of silence, another bureaucratic shrug, or another grave that had already been closed for years. The pacing of the inquiry shifted from the frantic energy of the Bovingdon arrest to a slow, grinding war of attrition against time and a system that had collectively looked the other way. The first and most visceral dead end was the hostile investigation in Slough. After his release from the high-security psychiatric hospital at Broadmoor in February 1971, Graham had been placed in a halfway house for former offenders. Pollard's team descended upon the hostel, a gray, demoralizing building that smelled of floor wax and institutional neglect. They interviewed the residents, men who were already on the fringes of society, drifters, and minor criminals who were used to keeping their heads down. The detectives looked for the Bovingdon bug here, and they found its whispers everywhere. They heard stories of a professor who was always eager to make the morning tea, a quiet young man who spoke with a chillingly refined accent. One man remembered a week of excruciating stomach cramps. Another spoke of a sudden, patchy loss of hair that he had blamed on the stress of his release. But when the police looked for physical evidence, they found nothing. The cups had been washed 1,000 times, the tea canisters replaced, and the men who had been the most ill had long since moved on to other towns or disappeared into the anonymity of the London streets. Without a body, without a diary entry for that specific period, and without any remaining samples of the drinks, the Slough experiments remained a haunting suspicion, a dead end that suggested Graham had been practicing his craft on the most vulnerable members of society the moment he stepped out of Broadmoor's gates. Then came the paperwork dead end, a frustration that brought the investigation to the very heart of the British government. Pollard's men spent weeks in the dusty, windowless archives of the Home Office and the Ministry of Health, their fingers stained with the ink of 1,000 carbon copies. They were looking for the answer to a single, burning question: how is a man like Graham Young allowed to take a job in a laboratory with access to the very poisons he had used as a child? The search was a descent into a Kafkaesque nightmare of buck-passing and administrative amnesia. They found that while Graham's psychiatric records were extensive, the warning that should have accompanied his release had been diluted into a series of vague, polite euphemisms. His parole officer had been told he suffered from a personality disorder, but the word poisoner was conspicuously absent from the summary. The company at Bovingdon had been told he was a bright lad with a troubled background, a description that could have applied to 1,000 different youths. The detectives realized that the system had not just failed, It had actively facilitated the massacre by choosing the path of least resistance. This was a dead end of a different sort, a structural failure that meant no single individual could be held responsible for the catastrophe. The investigators stood in those archives, surrounded by the silence of the state, realizing that the bug had been allowed to spread by the very people who were supposed to be the doctors of the social order. The investigation then turned its sights back to the death of Molly Young in 1862. This was the original sin of the Graham Young saga, the incident that had started it all. Pollard knew that if he could prove Graham had murdered his stepmother, it would establish a 10-year pattern of lethal intent. But the cremation dead end stood in his way like a tombstone. Molly had been cremated shortly after her death, her remains turned to ash before any toxicological analysis could be performed. The detectives interviewed the original doctors, men who were now elderly and whose memories were clouded by the passage of time. They spoke of gallstones and sudden complications, their voices trembling as they realized they had likely signed a death certificate for a murder they had failed to see. The police searched for any remaining samples of her hair or tissue that might have been kept in a hospital archive, but they found only empty folders. The fire had been too thorough. Molly Young was a ghost that could not testify, a victim whose story ended in a furnace. This dead end was a psychological blow to the team. It meant that the most significant act of Graham's youth would forever remain a matter of strong suspicion, rather than a proven fact, a hole in the center of the case that the Count himself would later mock in his interviews. The psychological interrogation of Graham Young himself became perhaps the most frustrating dead end of all. Pollard and his colleagues spent hours across from him in the interview rooms, the air thick with the smell of the cigarettes Graham smoked with a languid, aristocratic grace. Graham was a master of the red herring. He would offer a tantalizing detail, a mention of a woman in a park he had met in Slough who never quite felt the same after their picnic, and then retreat into a wall of polite silence when pushed for a name or a location. He led the police on a series of wild goose chases through the parks and libraries of London, watching with a secret, arrogant glee as they wasted hundreds of man-hours searching for victims that may or may not have existed. He was playing a game of intellectual chess with the law, using his own history as the board. He would claim that he had distributed his gifts more widely than the police could ever imagine, hinting at a death toll that reached into the dozens. But without names, without bodies, and without a paper trail, these claims were just more ghosts. The investigators realized they were being toyed with, used as an audience for Graham's final performance as a master of death. The show, Don't Tell, of his behavior was a study in narcissism. He didn't want to confess his crimes so much as he wanted to lecture the police on his own genius. The search for an accomplice, or a mentor, also proved to be a fruitless detour. Based on some of the more cryptic entries in his Bovingdon diary, where he occasionally used the word we, or referred to consulting with an old friend, the police suspected that Graham might have had a partner, perhaps someone he had met in the corridors of Broadmoor. They conducted a massive review of the Broadmoor graduates, a group of men who had been released around the same time as Graham. They interviewed psychiatric nurses, wardens, and other inmates, looking for a shadow chemist who might have supplied Graham with his materials or encouraged his dark fantasies. They found a subculture of the broken and the disturbed, a world of men who lived in a state of perpetual, medicine-induced haze, but they found no partner. The we in the diary, the psychologists eventually concluded, was likely the royal we of a man who saw himself as a god, or perhaps a reference to the historical poisoners he admired, a phantom consultation with the long-dead William Palmer. This dead end highlighted the absolute, chilling isolation of the suspect. Graham Young was a man who needed no one, a predator who found all the companionship he required in the vials and the powders of his laboratory. The scientific dead end was a constant struggle for the forensic teams. Thallium and antimony are perfect weapons in part because of how they interact with the human body over time. The investigators were dealing with a cold crime scene at Hadlands. By the time they were called in, months had passed since the first poisonings. They spent weeks testing the canteen equipment, the coffee machines, and even the dust in the storeroom, but the bug had been a targeted strike, not a general contamination. Graham was too precise to leave a residue that could be easily found. They looked for traces of the poisons in the soil around the factory and in the local water supply, fearing a wider catastrophe, but they found only the background noise of industrial pollution. The science was failing to catch up with the art of the poisoner. The detectives felt a sense of mounting inadequacy. They were used to blood spatter and fingerprints, things that shouted the truth. But Graham's work was a whisper, a silent alteration of a person's chemistry that left no mark on the room. The lack of hard, forensic evidence from the office itself meant they were entirely dependent on the diary, a document that the defense would later claim was merely the work of a fantasy writer and a troubled dreamer. The investigation also struggled with the unsolved illnesses of Bovingdon. While Bob Eggle and Fred Biggs were the clear fatalities, there were dozens of other employees who had suffered from minor versions of the bug. The police interviewed every single one of them, but the testimonies were a chaotic jumble of symptoms that could have been anything from the flu to food poisoning. One man spoke of a temporary blindness. A woman spoke of a metallic taste in her mouth after a birthday cake was shared. But because these people had recovered, their bodies had already filtered out the evidence of the crime. The investigators were trying to build a case out of shadows and half-remembered sensations. Every recovered victim was a missed opportunity for a definitive test, a dead end that left the police with a list of probable poisonings that would never hold up in a court of law. The frustration in the incident room was palpable. They knew that Graham had struck many more than the two he killed, but the evidence was a fading echo, a chemical signature that had vanished with the victim's own recovery. The pawn shop dead end was another attempt to find a motive. The police suspected that Graham might have been stealing from his victims, pawning their belongings to fund his chemical purchases. They visited every pawnbroker and antique dealer in North London and Hertfordshire, showing photographs of Bob Eggle's watch and Fred Biggs' ring. They found a world of grimy ledgers and suspicious men who dealt in the small tragedies of the poor, but they found no link to Graham Young. The Teesside poisoner was not a thief. He didn't want the gold or the silver. He wanted the life force. The lack of a financial motive made the case even harder to explain to a public that expected a reason for such slaughter. To Graham, the act of poisoning was its own reward, a self-contained aesthetic experience that required no secondary gain. This lack of a human motive was a conceptual dead end that forced the investigators to confront the reality of a purely nihilistic evil. The pressure from the media added another layer of complexity and noise to the investigation. As the story of the Broadmoor graduate broke, the tabloids began to run wild with sensationalist stories of Graham's army of poisoners and the Bovingdon death squad. These reports triggered a nationwide panic, leading to hundreds of false tips from people who believed their tea had been tampered with by a quiet boy in a suit. The CID had to investigate every one of these claims, fearing that Graham might have been part of a larger network or that a copycat was at work. They followed leads to the north of England, to Scotland, and even to the coastal towns of the south, only to find that the poisonings were actually cases of stomach flu or, in some instances, deliberate fabrications by people looking for attention. This deluge of misinformation was a white noise dead end that nearly drowned out the actual evidence. The detectives were exhausted, their nerves frayed by the constant need to separate the signal from the noise in a case that was already a nightmare of ambiguity. As the winter of 1971 turned into the spring of 1972, the investigation phase of the Graham Young case was a study in the limits of modern detection when faced with a prehistoric malice. The dead ends were not just failures of the police. They were the boundaries of the world Graham had built for himself, a world where the most important things were always hidden and the most lethal actions left no trace. Detective Pollard looked at the map of the investigation, a sea of pins and lines that led to empty spaces and ash. They had their man, and they had his diary, but the complete story of Graham Young remained a puzzle with half its pieces missing. They stood at the threshold of the trial, knowing that the defense would use every one of these dead ends to claim that the prosecution was merely chasing a ghost. The atmosphere in the CID was one of somber, heavy determination. They couldn't prove the hostile poisonings, they couldn't exhume Molly, and they couldn't find the woman in the park. But they had the bodies of Bob and Fred, and they had the signature of a man who loved poison more than he loved the world. The final image of this phase is one of absolute, clinical isolation. Graham Young sat in his cell, a man who had successfully turned his life into a series of NGO cut for the rest of humanity. He was the only one who knew the truth, and he enjoyed that exclusivity with a terrifying, quiet intensity. The investigation had mapped the crater left by his arrival in Bovingdon, but the depths of the volcano remained unexplored. As the files were prepared for the Old Bailey, the detectives realized that they were not just bringing a man to justice, they were bringing a scientific phenomenon to court. The investigation was a reminder that some crimes are so deep and so dark that the light of the law can only ever illuminate the edges. The dead ends were the silent witnesses to the children Graham had silenced and the years he had spent as a ghost. The stage was now set for the final confrontation, where the justice of the system would have to reckon not only with the actions of a single man, but with its own role in allowing the experiments to continue. This concludes Part 6 of the script. The investigation has been portrayed as a series of frustrating detours and structural failures, emphasizing the psychological and forensic dead ends that allowed Graham Young's earlier crimes to remain in the shadows. The tone was kept analytical and somber, reflecting the reality of a case that was as much about systemic failure as it was about individual depravity. The decisive breakthrough in the case of Graham Young did not arrive with the dramatic flair of a sudden confession or the discovery of a hidden weapon, but rather through the slow, agonizing crystallization of a medical impossibility into a forensic certainty. By mid-November 1971, the atmosphere within the John Hadland Laboratories in Bovingdon had reached a state of near-total psychological collapse, a community paralyzed by the invisible bug that seemed to strike without rhyme or reason. But while the employees lived in fear, a small, dedicated group of investigators and medical professionals began to look past the symptoms and toward the source. The breakthrough began in the quiet, sterile office of Dr. Ian Anderson, the company doctor whose clinical intuition had finally been sharpened to a razor's edge by the sheer statistical improbability of the illnesses. He sat surrounded by the medical files of 70 different men, his eyes tracing the erratic, jagged lines of their health records. The bug was no longer a mystery to him, it was a signature. He realized that the wide variety of symptoms, the vomiting, the hair loss, the agonizing nerve pain, were all diverging branches of the same lethal tree. The show, don't tell, of the medical breakthrough was found in the color of the victim's hair and the specific, burning quality of their pain. Dr. Anderson realized that he wasn't looking for a virus, but for a heavy metal, a substance that was being systematically introduced into the most sacred ritual of the English workplace, the tea round. The moment the investigation shifted from the clinical to the criminal occurred during a tense, suffocatingly quiet meeting at the laboratories. Detective Superintendent Christopher Pollard had been called in, not yet as an investigator of murder, but as a consultant on a potential environmental hazard. Graham Young, ever the arrogant scholar, could not resist the urge to participate in his own unraveling. He sat in the corner of the room, his posture a study in calculated, scholarly refinement, his eyes reflecting a cold, intellectual fire that seemed to mock the confusion of the adults around him. When Dr. Anderson mentioned the peculiar, burning feet syndrome of Fred Biggs, Graham leaned forward, his voice a smooth, modulated baritone that carried the weight of a death sentence. He asked, with a chillingly helpful lilt, why the authorities hadn't yet considered thallium poisoning. He spoke of the rare metal with the familiarity of a lover, detailing its tastelessness, its odorless quality, and its perfect mimicry of other diseases. This was the first major breakthrough, the intellectual signature of the killer. Pollard watched Graham, noting the way the boy's fingers steepled in a gesture of godlike superiority. He realized that the store's clerk was not just an observer, he was the architect. The show, don't tell, of Graham's guilt was his inability to hide his own genius from an audience he considered inferior. Following this meeting, the second and most devastating breakthrough arrived from the archives of the British state. When Pollard requested a background check on the bright young man who knew so much about toxicology, the response from Scotland Yard was like a physical blow to the investigation team. The files revealed that the man serving tea to the unsuspecting workers of Bovingdon was the very same Graham Young who had been incarcerated in Broadmoor for the systematic poisoning of his own family 10 years prior. The realization was a rupture in the reality of the investigators. They weren't just dealing with a new case, they were dealing with a catastrophic failure of the system. The breakthrough was the sudden, horrifying clarity that the monster had been placed in the center of the fold by the very people meant to guard the gate. This information changed everything. The Bovingdon bug had a name, a history, and a methodology that was already written in the blood of a stepmother and the suffering of a father. The pressure in the incident room shifted from a search for a cause to a desperate race against time to secure the evidence before the next dose was administered. The third pillar of the breakthrough was the physical recovery of the poisoner's diary. When the police executed the search warrant on Graham's rented room in Hemel Hempstead, they weren't just looking for bottles, they were looking for his mind. The room was a study in clinical obsession, organized, sterile, and smelling faintly of metallic salts. Hidden within the mundane clutter of a lodger's life, they found the small, black-bound notebook that would become the cornerstone of the prosecution. As Pollard opened the pages, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Here was the show, don't tell, of pure psychopathy. Graham hadn't written a diary of feelings, he had written a ledger of biological decay. He used the cold language of the laboratory to describe the destruction of his colleagues. Subject A was Bob Eggle. Subject B was Fred Biggs. He recorded the exact dosages of thallium and antimony he had slipped into their mugs and the precise physiological results. He wrote of his disappointment when a victim showed resilience and his scientific satisfaction when the hair began to fall out. The diary was the ultimate breakthrough, a direct, unadulterated window into a void where empathy should have been. It was the proof of premeditation, of a cold-blooded experiment that viewed human beings as nothing more than disposable reagents. While the diary provided the what and the why, the forensic breakthrough required the testimony of the dead. The exhumation of Bob Eggle was a pivotal, visceral moment in the investigation. It took place on a night of biting, damp cold, the kind of winter evening that seemed to pull the warmth from the very bones of the living. Under the harsh, flickering glare of portable floodlights, the iron teeth of the excavator tore into the frost-hardened Hertfordshire soil. The sound was a rhythmic, guttural groan that echoed the collective mourning of a village that had buried its secrets too soon. The detectives stood in a circle, their breath blooming in the air like small, fleeting ghosts, as the coffin of Bob Eggle was slowly raised from the earth. The sensory details were overwhelming, the smell of wet earth, the clinking of chains, and the heavy, stagnant silence of the cemetery. When the Home Office pathologists analyzed the remains, the breakthrough was absolute. Despite the months in the grave, Bob's body was a reservoir of thallium. The metal was indestructible, a silent witness that had waited in the dark to tell the truth. This was the forensic gotcha that Graham had never anticipated. He believed the poison would vanish with the person, but the science he loved so much had eventually betrayed him. The final breakthrough was the scientific alignment of the evidence found in Graham's possession with the bodies of his victims. In the lining of his heavy winter coat, the police found a small, hidden pocket containing a lethal dose of thallium, what Graham later called his exit dose. But the laboratory analysis showed that the specific batch of thallium in his pocket was an exact chemical match to the thallium found in Bob Eggle's organs and the traces found in the Bovingdon canteen. This was the golden thread of the case. It wasn't just a poison, it was the poison. The investigators had successfully traced the path from the supplier to Graham's pocket, from Graham's hand to the tea mug, and from the tea mug to the grave. This chain of evidence was a masterpiece of modern forensic work, a clinical reconstruction of a series of events that had occurred in the shadows of an unsuspecting office. The breakthrough was complete. The Bovingdon bug was dead, replaced by the definitive, undeniable guilt of a man who had treated a photographic lab as his private slaughterhouse. The atmosphere in the Bovingdon village during these days of breakthrough was one of profound, somber realization. The initial shock had curdled into a cold, hard anger. People remembered the way Graham had looked at them, The way he had held the kettle, and the way he had asked after their health with such a helpful smile. Every polite interaction was now revealed to be a lethal probe, a predator testing the fences of his prey. The show, don't tell, of the community's reaction was the sudden, absolute rejection of the office social rituals. The tea trolleys remained empty, the mugs were discarded or taken home to be boiled, and the sound of the kettle, once a symbol of comfort, was now a trigger for a visceral, instinctive fear. The breakthrough had not just solved a crime, it had shattered the social contract of the village. The people of Bovingdon realized that they had been living in a landscape of secrets, where the most dangerous thing in the room was the very thing they had welcomed with open arms. In the interrogation room, the breakthrough took on a more psychological dimension. Graham, confronted with the diary and the forensic results, did not collapse in shame. Instead, he became a consultant for his own prosecution. He corrected the police on the dosages he had used, argued with them about the specific symptoms he had observed, and spoke of his victims with a detached, academic interest that chilled the bones of the interviewing officers. The breakthrough. Here was the final, absolute confirmation of his diagnosis as a psychopath. He wasn't a man who had made a mistake. He was a different species of human, one that lacked the basic equipment for remorse or love. He was a man who saw the trial as his final lecture, a chance to explain his scientific discoveries to a world that he believed was too small to understand him. This arrogance, which had been his greatest strength as a hidden killer, became his ultimate undoing as a suspect. He couldn't help but brag. He couldn't help but show the detectives how he had done it, believing that his brilliance would somehow exempt him from the consequences. The investigative team felt a sense of heavy, exhausted victory as the pieces finally fell into place. They had navigated the maze of Graham's lies, the dead ends of the SLU hostels, and the silence of a cremated dead. They had brought the bug into the light. But the breakthrough was also a moment of profound sadness. They looked at the photographs of Bob Eggle and Fred Biggs, men who were murdered for no reason other than curiosity. They realized that every data point in Graham's diary was a human life, a family shattered, and a community scarred. The show, don't tell, of the investigation's success was the silence of the incident room as the final report was signed. It wasn't a moment of celebration, it was a moment of witness. They had documented the impossible, and they had found the truth in the most horrific of places. The breakthroughs were a testament to the power of science and the persistence of the law, but they were also a reminder of the fragility of the peace we take for granted. As the sun set on the final day of the primary investigation, the village of Bovingdon was a place of long shadows and cold light. The police tape around the Hadland laboratories flickered in the wind, a bright, artificial yellow against the gray brick. The breakthrough was the realization that the world would never be the same for the survivors. They had been given the answer to their mystery, but the answer was more terrifying than the mystery itself. They knew now that they had been the subjects of an experiment, that their pain had been recorded with a fountain pen, and that their friend had been their executioner. The breakthrough was the end of the bug, but it was the beginning of a lifetime of suspicion. Every cup of tea, every offered drink, and every helpful gesture would now be viewed through the lens of what had happened in 1971. The breakthrough was the light that had finally pierced the fog, but it was a cold, clinical light that revealed the full extent of the wreckage. The forensic mapping of the thallium through the factory was perhaps the most complex part of the breakthrough. The investigators had to track the flow of the poison through the social network of the office. They found that the poisoning wasn't a general attack, but a series of precision strikes. Graham had chosen his subjects with care, testing different levels of toxicity on different individuals to see if he could achieve a specific result. This realization that he was fine-tuning the agony was the final break in the psychological barrier for the investigators. They stopped seeing him as a troubled youth and started seeing him as a lethal artist. The breakthrough was the understanding that the murders were an aesthetic choice for Graham. He liked the symmetry of the symptoms. He liked the poetry of the slow decline. The show, don't tell, of his malice was found in the varying degrees of suffering he had meticulously engineered across the office floor. The final image of the breakthrough phase is Pollard standing by the Thames, watching the sun rise on the day the charges were finalized. He felt the weight of the files in his bag, a record of a decade of systematic slaughter. The breakthrough had taken him from the suburbs of Neasden to the wards of Broadmoor and, finally, to the graves of Bovingdon. He had seen the Teesside poisoner in all his masks, the student, the son, the clerk, and the god. He realized that the breakthrough was just the first step in a much longer reckoning. The law had its man, but the nation now had to reckon with the question of how he had been allowed to return. The breakthrough was the closing of one door and the opening of another, a path that led directly to the Old Bailey and the final, public unveiling of the boy who loved poison. The air was cold, the water was dark, but the truth was finally, irrevocably, in the light. This part of the script has focused on the intellectual, forensic, and administrative breakthroughs that ended Graham Young's spree, moving from the doctor's suspicion to the exhumation of the dead and the discovery of the poisoner's diary. It highlights the contrast between the clinical arrogance of the killer and the visceral, heavy reality of the evidence. The pacing was kept intense and urgent, reflecting the final stages of a major criminal inquiry.
Gemini đã nói.
The morning of June 19, 1972, arrived at the St. Albans Crown Court with a heavy, expectant heat that seemed to press against the ancient stone walls of the courthouse. Outside, the world was alive with the vibrant, chaotic energy of the early 70s, but inside the wood-paneled confines of Court No. 1, the air was stagnant and thick with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and the collective, held breath of a community seeking a reckoning. This was the moment the Bovingdon bug would be stripped of its mysterious, quasi-biological mask and revealed as the calculated work of a single, slender man sitting in the dock. The public gallery was a sea of strained faces, the widows in their somber black, the survivors with their trembling hands hidden in their laps, and the curious who had come to see the Teesside poisoner in the flesh. When Graham Young was led into the courtroom, the silence that fell was not one of respect, but of a profound, visceral revulsion. At 24 years old, he looked less like a mass murderer and more like an academic who had been interrupted in the middle of a complex equation. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his hair was combed with a military precision, and his eyes, behind a pair of thick-rimmed glasses, moved across the room with a flat, predatory curiosity. He didn't look at the families of the men he had killed with remorse. He looked at them as if they were specimens he had already finished studying. The prosecution was led by Sir Kenneth Jones, a man whose presence in the courtroom was a study in gravitas and measured, legal steel. He began the opening statement not with a shout, but with a clinical, chronological reconstruction of a decade of systematic slaughter. The show, don't tell, of the prosecution's case was found in the physical evidence laid out on the long wooden tables, the vials of thallium, the bundles of hair recovered from the victims' homes, and, most importantly, the small, black-bound notebook that had become the voice of the dead. As Jones began to read from the poisoner's diary, the atmosphere in the court turned glacial. The words, written in Graham's neat, flowing hand, described the destruction of Bob Eggle and Fred Biggs with a detachment of a weather report. Graham sat in the dock, his face a mask of arrogant calm, occasionally nodding as if he were approving of the lawyer's pronunciation or the accuracy of the chemical formulas being discussed. He was a man who felt he was finally the center of the world's attention, a dark star whose light was being measured by the very system he had so thoroughly outmaneuvered for months. The defense, led by Mr. Michael Argyle, attempted to construct a psychological shield around the defendant that was as complex as it was desperate. Their primary gambit was the fiction theory. They argued that the Black Notebook was not a record of crimes, but the draft of a sensationalist novel, a work of dark fantasy, created by a young man who was obsessed with toxicology but lacked the moral compass to understand the boundary between thought and action. They portrayed Graham as a dreamer, a man whose imagination had been warped by the years spent in Broadmoor, suggesting that he was a victim of his own intelligence and the system's failure to provide him with a proper outlet. The show, don't tell, of the defense's strategy was Graham's own demeanor. He would often smirk when his lawyers described his vivid imagination, playing the part of the misunderstood artist with a terrifying, quiet intensity. He wanted the court to believe he was a writer of horrors, not a perpetrator of them, but the weight of the bodies in the ground made the argument feel hollow and offensive to those sitting in the gallery. The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch during the testimony of the survivors and the families. When the widow of Fred Biggs took the stand, her grief was a physical presence that seemed to fill the room. She spoke of the burning feet syndrome, of the way her robust, healthy husband had been reduced to a weeping, paralyzed shell in a matter of weeks. She didn't have to call Graham a monster. The way she refused to even look toward the dock, her body physically recoiling from his direction, told the story more clearly than any indictment. The survivors, men like Jethro Batt and Peter Buck, walked to the stand with a slow, deliberate caution, their movements still hampered by the lingering effects of the thallium. They spoke of the tea rounds, of the bitter taste, of the drinks Graham had served them, and of the way he had watched them as they swallowed the poison. The show, don't tell, here was the visible tremors in their hands as they held the Bible to take the oath, a permanent, physical signature of Graham Young's malice. They were the living evidence of a betrayal that had turned their workplace into a slaughterhouse. The forensic breakthrough of the exhumation was presented with a chilling, technical clarity. The Home Office pathologist described the process of raising Bob Eggles's coffin from the damp Hertfordshire earth and the subsequent analysis that found his organs saturated with thallium. They explained that thallium is a perfect weapon because it is indestructible, a metal that remains in the body long after the flesh has begun to fail. The prosecution used this to dismantle the natural causes defense that Graham's lawyers had initially floated. The show, don't tell, was the presentation of the chemical results, the charts and the graphs that showed a lethal concentration of the heavy metal in a man who is supposed to have died of a virus. The science that Graham loved so much was now the very thing that was tying the noose around his neck. He watched the forensic experts with an intense, scholarly focus, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, perhaps pointing out a minor error in their explanation of the thallium's molecular weight. He was a man who could not resist being the smartest person in the room, even when that room was his own execution chamber. The most anticipated moment of the trial was Graham Young's own testimony. When he stepped into the witness box, the atmosphere was so thin it felt as though the court were standing on the edge of a cliff. Graham didn't speak with the voice of a criminal. He spoke with the voice of a professor. He was articulate, polite, and terrifyingly arrogant. He attempted to maintain the fiction defense, claiming that he had merely observed the illnesses of his colleagues and recorded them to add realism to his book. But as the cross-examination began, the mask of the scholar started to slip, revealing the predator underneath. Under the relentless, surgical questioning of Sir Kenneth Jones, Graham's hubris became his greatest liability. He couldn't help but correct the prosecution on the nuances of toxicology. When asked about the lethal potential of antimony, he went into a 3-minute lecture on its history and its